Hello, this is Henry Emphrey, and this is a Babylon.js tutorial. I'm going to make this tutorial to show you how to make something like this. Now, this is a game that features a 2D sprite in the 3D world. See, you got this 2D sprite that can walk around, and it can go further in the distance, and it can come back to the horizon. And then it can walk around, and then it collides with the spear here. As you see, I can't go around this sphere right here. So this is what I'm going to teach you. The way that I create my character is I use this program called Paint.net. I made my first frame and my second frame. And the way that I made my first and second frame is I kept the head and body the same, but I just changed the legs to keep the smooth animation. I created this first frame, and then I saved it. Then I just erased the legs and put some new legs and saved that as frame 2. So that's how I made my right animation. I saved both files in my Babylon.js game folder. And then when I had both frames, I went to this website here called easygif.com. And the way that I did that was I went to this website and I chose my Babylon.js game folder, and I selected these two frames that I made, or PNG files that I made. And then I uploaded them. I put don't stack frames, then clicked make APG. Then I converted this animation file to Sprite to make my Sprite sheet. I aligned them horizontally, converted the Sprite sheet, and then I ended up with this. Finally, I saved them, and the file was saved at the bottom of the screen here. In fact, you get open folder, and this is my file. Maybe your Sprite downloaded somewhere else, but mine's downloaded to my downloads folder. And all I did was just take the Sprite sheet and dragged it over to my Babylon.js games folder.
I renamed my file to Henry.
Next, in order to get my Skybox, I went to this Babylon.js playground. And to get the exact Skybox that I have, you can just type in this URL here. And then all I did was just download the zip file. And mine showed up at the bottom of the screen here. And then I went into the folder, and I opened that zip file up and went to texture, and you can see the Skybox right here. So after you do that, I just drag that into my Babylon.js folder as well. Now, the first thing that I did to make that scene was I came to the Babylon.js's playground, and you can see the link up here. And then all I did was download the zip, and here's the file that was downloaded. And then I opened it, and then I just took this index file and dragged it into that folder there.
I then renamed the file to Henry's Game Example.
Okay, so whenever you open up the HTML code example that we downloaded from Playground, it's going to come pre-packaged with all these different URLs and web addresses in it. So just make sure you just leave these things as they are. And same thing here with this CSS stuff. The main thing we're concerned about is the stuff down here. This stuff is also comes prepackaged, and this stuff comes prepackaged. And bear in mind, I try to keep everything together. Like for example, things dealing with the scene, I try to have all those codes and whatnot together. Things dealing with the camera, I keep all the camera stuff together. And before I get started, I don't claim to be a genius programmer or anything like that. I'm just trying to make something to get people started on making games in Babylon.js. And then you can take what you learned from this tutorial and expand on it. Okay, so first we initialize our scene. This variable here comes with the file that we downloaded. But this Action Manager part is what I've included. It initializes the controls that we're going to use. And in our particular game, we're going to use the arrow keys. So we'll be using what was set up here later. So you might want to just copy this part down. Next, we have our camera. This camera comes with the file that we downloaded. And this is how you initialize the camera. Next, we have our light. This light also comes with the file that we downloaded. And this initializes the light. The next part is the input map. This input map is what will store the variables for our controls and our arrow keys that we'll be using later. Next, we have our Skybox. And the Skybox, we included that specular hdr.dds file that we worked with earlier. And we attached the Skybox to our scene. Next, we have the ground mesh. We set up the ground and then set up the ground materials, or the ground materials is what the ground would look like. And we position our ground so it will be below the player or below the screen. And next we set up our player. This Sprite Manager player part was just something that I copied from the Babylon.js site. And the only part that I added was this Emphrey.png. This is the animation file for our player that we worked with earlier. One frame from that file is 70 in width and the height is 112 pixels. Next, we use the Sprite Manager player part here, and we give our player a name, and then I set my player size to 2. You can set your player size to whatever you want, and I position my player on the 0 axis so that, well, it'll start in the middle of the screen. The next part that we have is the sphere. This bar part initializes the sphere. 16 is the size of the sphere. This is how we position the sphere on the x-axis and y-axis. Next, we have our collision box. Now, our collision box is attached to the player. And I made the collision box to fit according to the player's size. And I position the collision box, this x and y coordinates, onto the player. Okay. And I made the collision box invisible. And the collision box is when the player will collide with other things that are in the game. For example, when it'll collide with the sphere or collide with the ground. When the collision box collides with the ground, it will keep the player from going through the ground. And when the player collides with the sphere, well, it won't be able to just walk through the sphere. You'll see later. Okay. Now, I think this scene on before render observable, I think that's our game loop. I'm not sure. But this next part says if the collision box does not, this exclamation mark means not, So again, it says if the collision box does not intersect with the ground, then make both the collision box and the player go down. So in other words, this is our gravity. Then make the collision box y position minus equals 0.1 and the player's position y position minus equals 0.1. Both means go down. Minus equals 0.1 means go down. And this next part might be kind of confusing. This is the part that controls our animation. Well, first I set up my player animation start variable to control the player. Or control the animation. And this says if the arrow key right, arrow key left, arrow key up, or arrow key down is pressed, then player animation start is true. Otherwise, else means otherwise, player animation start equals false. But the confusing part is it says if the player animation start is false, then play the animation, play the walking animation. That's kind of strange because usually in game development it should say if the right key, left key, up key, or down key is pressed, then it should play the animation. But for some reason this had to be backwards. I don't know what the reason is. If anybody know the reason for this, then please explain that to us in the comment section below. So this will be only the confusing part right here. So just copy this part down because somehow it works. This next part has to do with if our player and its collision box run into the sphere and the player is coming from the right direction, this makes the sphere go away from the player and the ground will move accordingly, creating a bouncing effect. You'll see what I mean a little later. And the same is true down here. It says if the player's collision box intersects with the sphere and the player is coming from the left, or the left arrow key is being pressed, the sphere is to move to the left, and the ground will move accordingly. Again, this is another way of creating a bounce effect if the player is coming from the left. Now this next part says if the player's collision box collides with the sphere and the player is going away from the screen, this up arrow key means the player will be going away from the screen, then once again the collision box and the player will not be able to just walk through the sphere like a ghost or something, because the sphere is a solid object, so the player will not be able to just walk through the sphere. The same is true is if the player in his collision box run into the sphere and this player is coming towards the screen. Once again, the player will not be able to just walk through the sphere because the sphere is a solid object. And once again, don't forget, the player and collision box are pretty much one and the same. And later I'll show you how that works too. Okay, this next part has to do with if the S button is pressed and the collision box is touching the ground, then the player goes up or the player jumps. And remember, above here, you remember we set our gravity to where if the collision box and the player is not on the ground, then the collision box and the player, when it reaches a certain height, goes down. So we have a jump and we have a gravity right here. Next part just means if the arrow key is pressed up, the player and its collision box goes away from the screen. Z plus equals 0.1 means the player goes away from the screen. This next part means if the down arrow keys is pressed, the player comes towards the screen. Z minus equals 0.1 means the player comes towards the screen, along with this collision box too. Because the player and collision box, once again, are one and the same again. And if this means if the right arrow key, this means if the right arrow key is pressed, the sphere goes towards the left, and so does the ground. This gives the illusion of the player moving. I'll explain that later. And this, when the right arrow key is pressed, this also means to play our walking animation forward. The 0 means play the animation forward or play it normally. And finally, if the left arrow key is pressed, the ground is to move towards the right, and the sphere is to move towards the right too. The ground and the sphere. Like I said, again, it gives the illusion of the sphere, of the player moving. And this time we're going towards the player is going towards the left, so we make the animation flip so that the player will be walking towards the left, and the animation will be playing as if the player is walking towards the left. This -1 makes the animation flip. Okay, so now let's play our game and see what happens. Don't forget to save all your results. And then, so now if I press the right arrow key, the sphere and ground are moving towards the left. And same thing if I press the left arrow key, the sphere and ground are moving towards the right. You know, it's giving that effect that our character is going somewhere when it's really not. So, and then let's see what happens if we run into the sphere. So when we run into the sphere, it creates this bouncing effect if we are approaching the sphere from the right. And the same will be true if we're approaching the sphere from the left. The sphere just bounces back to the left if we collide with it. And then if we try to approach the sphere from the front, see, we can't go anywhere because it's a solid object. So we're trying to go towards the sphere and it's not letting. Okay, and then let's see what happens when we try to approach the sphere from the back. See, same thing happens. We can't go any further. Now let's test our jump. So if I press the S key, our player goes up and comes back down. So that means our gravity is working. And let me show you one more thing to really ensure that our gravity is working. When we fall off this floor, our player falls down. I want to show you one more thing in our code example. Let me show you what's really happening with our collisions here. Let's now make this collision box visible. I'm change this to 4 and then I'm going to save it, because every time you make a change, you always want to save. And then let's restart this game. See, now I made my collision box visible, and this is what's really happening here. See, the sprite is not really colliding with this sphere here. It's this box that's colliding with it, you know, from all directions, as you can see. Okay, so that's what's really happening here. It's just a mesh to mesh collision. So let's change our collision box back to invisible. And then I'm going to save it, and there you have it. And that's how this game works. So I hope you learned something, and I hope what I've showed you here is enough to get you started on, you know, making games in Babylon.js. Maybe you can take what you learned here and expand on it. Till next time. Bye.